Welcome to the Arizona Author Series. This event was recorded on February 2nd, 2023. This Arizona Author Series is supported by the Arizona State Library, Archives, and Public Records, a division of the Secretary of State with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Daniel Arreola, the author of Postcards from the Sonora Border, Visualizing Place Through a Popular Lens, 1900s to 1950s. Daniel Arreola is a cultural and historical geographer who specializes in the study of Mexican-American borderland and Hispanic cultures in America. He is the recipient of the Palpivoris Medal from the American Geographical Society for his studies in regional geography, and the Carl O. Sauer Distinguished Scholarship Award and the Preston E. James Eminent Latin Americanist Career Award from the Conference of Latin Americanist Geographers for his Mexican borderland studies. His Tejano, South Texas book won the prestigious Jackson Prize from the Association of American Geographers. Arreola is the author of 7 scholarly books, including The Mexican Border Cities, Landscape Anatomy, and Place Personality with James R. Curtis, Tejano, South Texas, a Mexican-American cultural province, and Hispanic Spaces, Latino Places, Community and Cultural Diversity in Contemporary America. His recent works concern the visual historical geography of Mexican border towns, a research project in 4 volumes. The initial book in this project was Postcards from the Rio Bravo border, picturing the place, placing the picture 1900s to 1950s. 3 subsequent volumes include Postcards from the Sonora Border, Visualizing a Place Through a Popular Lens, 1900s to 1950s, Postcards from the Chihuahua Border, Revisiting a Pictorial Past, 1900s to 1950s, and Postcards from the Baja California Border, Portraying Townscape and Place, 1900s to 1950s. Arreola is presently writing a book titled The Mexican Restaurant in America, A Journey Across Time and Place. He is an Arizona State University Professor Emeritus and currently resides in Placitas, New Mexico. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Arreola and glad you can join us.
Well, greetings and bienvenidos from New Mexico. I want to thank the State of Arizona Research Library for this opportunity to share some of the items from my book, Postcards from the Sonora Border, Visualizing Place Through a Popular Lens. So we've already used too much time, so let's get started. Since we're going to talk about postcards, I thought I would say a few things by this screen about the history of postcards. Some of you that might be listening to this know that postcards are something that have been around since about the mid to the last part of the 19th century. They come to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, and they appear in a variety of formats. Some of the oldest formats are examples shown on this screen. They're called print postcards. Now, these were essentially graphically designed and produced for consumption. And when postcards first came out in the United States before 1908, you couldn't write on the back of the postcard, as you see in the bottom of the illustration on the right. The postcards, when they first came out, could only have the address on the back side. So the front part, if there was any illustration, as you can see from the middle image, the message that the writer of the postcard would have to put on the front part of the card. This was quite common until 1908, when it changed in the United States, and the U.S. government allowed what's called divided back postcards. The postcard on the lower right here, the Cavern Cafe in Nogales, Sonora, is a divided back postcard. So in the back, it has the place for a message and for the address. And this is what is common today for anybody who sent postcards right to the present. But you couldn't do this until 1908 in the United States. This screen actually shows you a kind of postcard that was very, very common. Some of you have seen these before. They were called linen print postcards. They were invented by the Kurt Teich Company out of Chicago. Kurt Teich was an immigrant German who comes to the United States and starts a print company in Chicago. And very early on in the 20th century begins to print postcards. In the 1920s and 30s, the company invented this process of making very colorful images in the front part of postcards that came to be called linen postcards, even though they aren't linen. It's simply the way in which the color is shown on the paper that makes it appear textured like a linen. Anyway, this example shows you how postcard companies actually operated. The Kurt Teich Company archives are in the Newberry Library in Chicago. The whole of the production archives, all of the examples of the cards the millions that they produced are there. And it's a good way to see how postcards were actually produced. The screen on the lower left, or the image on the lower left of the screen, shows a production page scrawled in handwritten script of how this particular postcard, the Cavern Cafe in Nogales, Sonora, was actually produced. It was titled. You can see the arrow pointing to the example of the postcard. You can see the name of the person, the company that actually ordered the card. You can see the number of cards that were ordered in this particular sequence. The name of the kind of card, it was called Art Color Tone, a particular copyrighted title for a card style by the Kurt Company. And then you can see a code underneath it that starts with an 8, and that 8 was the key to the date of the postcard, which was 1938. So this is just an example of what are called print postcards. Most of the postcards in my book, the Sonora Border volume, actually are this kind of a postcard, which are called photographic postcards. They are actually real photographs. They were taken from a negative. The negative was transposed onto photosensitive paper to produce a photographic postcard. They have advantages over the print postcards because, as you can see from this example of a street in Agua Prieta, one of the border towns of the Sonora border towns, the detail is really quite exquisite. With a magnifying glass and even with the unaided eye, you can see detail in a real photograph that you can't always see as clearly in a print postcard because of the way that they were graphically produced. So photographic postcards have a real advantage in trying to look at a place in the past. Sometimes the names of the photographers were given on the postcards or on the back of the postcards, as an example here, and other times they were not. Here's an example of one postcard that was produced by a photographer that was quite famous in the early 20th century along the Arizona border. His name was Cal Osbon, and he was present for several of the battles that were important Mexican Revolution battles that occurred on the Sonora border, especially in Agua Prieta, and this is one of his cards from that battle. His postcards are usually labeled with very humorous scripts, and if you had time to read the bottom of this script of this particular postcard, he has rather funny things to say about a very serious event, but this was just the nature of him as a postcard photographer. Now, the book that I'm going to be talking about, Postcards from the Sonora Border, Visualizing Place Through a Popular Lens, 1900 to 1950s, was the second installment, as Jan said, of a series of books that I did about the whole of the Mexican border using my postcard collection. This one was published in 2017 by the University of Arizona Press. It's still in print, so that if you're interested, you can actually find this both through the press website as well as through other online book purchasing sites. Now, there are three themes that I want to pursue in this. I can't cover the whole book in the time that I have, but several of the themes are important to what I want to share with you this afternoon. First is the notion of place. Place is to geography what time is to history. Historical geographers, and I am a historical geographer, part of what we try and do is to unravel the geographies of the past, to understand the changes in places. If places are the things that we try and study, we're interested in understanding the relationship between people and their place. It turns out that picture postcards, in this case real photographic postcards, are visual materials that really are quite useful to see changes in place over time. How is this done? It turns out that postcard photographers unknowingly and unwittingly would come back generation after generation and take pictures of the same streets, the same landmarks, the same locations, not just in Mexican border towns, but everywhere that real photographic postcards and postcards were taken and made all across the world. So if you have enough of these postcards, you have one place seen multiple times through many views, the same scene. I call this kind of analysis serial visual analysis, because what you're doing is you're looking at the same place through time over a series of different images. And this I've argued this in all of my books. I think it's actually something that postcards enable that are almost impossible to do with any other kind of visual medium. Why is that? Postcards were commercially produced, so there were so many of them that were made that if you gather enough of them, what one of my photographic artist colleagues calls visual density. If you have enough of them, you can actually construct a kind of visual serial analysis of a place through time. The place and time we're going to start with, of course, is Sonora, the state that people in Arizona are quite familiar with because it is the Mexican border state directly to the south of the state of Arizona. Sonora is a very important place for Sonora, or for Arizona, I should say, because historically, the culture of early Arizona comes from Sonora, the early Spanish culture, and eventually the Mexican culture that evolved out of that. The towns that we're going to be looking at that I discuss in the book in detail are Agua Prieta, Naco, Nogales, Sonoita, and San Luis Rio Colorado. You can see all of these on this map. The oldest of these towns is actually a town that wasn't a border town when it was founded, and that is the town of Sonoita. It was founded, as we'll see, as a mission settlement by the Spanish in the 1700s. So there was no boundary here. There was no United States in this part of what is the western part of North America. Nogales is a town most Arizonans are familiar with, and many of you have probably gone there if you're from Arizona. It was a railroad town founded in the 19th century, and today is the largest of the Sonora border towns. Agua Prieta, Naco, and San Luis Rio Colorado, sometimes just called San Luis RC, are all 20th century border towns. So they're much more recent than Nogales even. And we'll look at each one of these and some of the qualities that photographic postcards enable us to see about these places. I'm going to start with Agua Prieta. This is one of my favorite postcards because it's a map, and as a geographer, you know that we enjoy maps and we deal with maps in lots of different ways. This map postcard was created by Emery Cobb. You can see his name in the lower right. It was copyrighted in 1928 when he produced the illustration. It's a very good map because it shows the relationship of places in southern and central Arizona, as well as southwestern New Mexico, with the Mexican Sonora border town of Agua Prieta directly across the boundary from Douglas, which you can see clearly on this map. Cobb did a very interesting illustration of a simple grid of Agua Prieta to show the main street where the arrows are running right down Avenida 3, which was the street that I showed you in the previous real photo postcard. And then he highlights one of the classic landmarks of early 20th century Agua Prieta, the Curio Cafe that was run by a Mrs. Gatliff. And we'll have more to say about the Curio Cafe in just a little bit. Now, for each one of these border towns, what I had done in the book is that I have a generalized map that shows the grid of the town itself with key locations, not all locations, but just those locations that were critical to the postcard photography and the postcard representation. So here we've got an outline map on the left of the screen of Agua Prieta, and you'll notice right away that there's two different Agua Prietas here divided by the railroad track, the Ferrocarril das Nacosari. The one on the left-hand side is the older settlement of Agua Prieta, and there have been people living here even before the town of Agua Prieta was founded. And you can see that the block arrangement of the streets and the residence blocks are all kind of irregular, and that was fairly typical of towns that were laid out haphazard. But by the early 20th century, when Agua Prieta was laid out formally, it began to develop, as you see on the right-hand side of the image, into a formal grid pattern with blocks of equal size and streets intersecting those blocks at 90-degree angles. But the railroad was the defining feature of Agua Prieta. And so the crossing was both a rail crossing, as shown at the top of the map, but also a pedestrian crossing. The pedestrian crossing is Avenida 3, the main street of Agua Prieta today. Some of the landmarks that are on this map are the crossing, the customs house, the depot, the church and the plaza, and the bull ring. I show all of these and other places within the book, but I can only highlight some of them this afternoon. Two of the images on the right, the one on the right is showing you a parade in front of the customs house that was a very important building in Agua Prieta. And then on the lower right shows the railroad, on the lower right shows the railroad track and some of the domestic residences of early Agua Prieta in the 1910s and 20s. The border crossing here shown for Agua Prieta and Douglas was actually a very critical landscape and landmark for all of the border towns, not just the Sonora border towns. It was critical because it was the place where Mexico and the United States came together. So Americans that would go into Mexico had to cross through the border crossing and the Mexican customs officials, and Mexicans that would cross into the United States had to go across American customs officials run by the Treasury, the customs offices at that time. This is before the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol, of course, doesn't have jurisdiction over the crossing itself, as some of you know. But this sequence of images shows you how a 1910s view, a 1920s view on the top, and then a 1950s view in the lower right can be put together to see how one particular location within the Agua Prieta-Douglas border area can be seen through time, a 1910s view, a 1920s, and a 1950s. And you can inspect the various buildings and landscapes that were there and weren't there at different points of time. Hence this serial analysis that I talked about that's capable with real photographic postcards. One of the most important places of every border town, in fact, of every Mexican town, is the plaza. Those of you that have traveled to the border or traveled to Mexico know that the plaza is the social nerve center of a community. It's where lots of public events take place. In the Arizona-Sonora border towns, every one of them that was founded had a plaza somewhere within the community. The upper left, you see a view of the plaza on the Cinco de Mayo in 1913 for Agua Prieta. And in the lower right, you see a view of that plaza much more formally developed in the 1950s. These plazas evolved over time. In the early settlements, they were quite sparse, and they would just have houses around them, a rather open area. You can see the bandstand or kiosco in the upper left hand of the older postcard image. And then you can see how that kiosco or bandstand became formally developed architecturally at later times. You can also see the church that came in to the plaza in Agua Prieta on the lower right. The main street of Agua Prieta, as I said earlier, was called Avenida Tres or Avenida 3 in the 1920s. Its name became Pan American Avenue in the 1940s. And today in Agua Prieta, it's called Avenida Pan Americana. So here what I've done is assemble three different views from the 1920s, the 40s, and the 50s to again show you how these photographic postcards enable one to see the same place over time. And each one of them is looking north to the boundary. So you see the tower of the customs house in every one of the images. But in each one of them, it's a different time. So there are different storefront names, different automobiles, different infrastructure of the streets. But this is what enables a geographer, a historical geographer, to actually reconstruct what the place was like through these visual images over time, this serial analysis. The Arizona-Sonora border towns were very famous during the Mexican Revolution, and Agua Prieta stands out as one of the more famous of these because it was the scene of several early battles, the 1911 battle and the more famous 1915 battle. When these battles took place, because the American border town was right next to the Mexican border town, they obviously created a kind of spectacle. And in Agua Prieta, as you can see on the lower left, courtesy of the Douglas Historical Society, an image of people up on the rooftop looking at one of the battles across the border into Agua Prieta. The other images show you a Cal Osbon. They're both Cal Osbon cards, the photographer I introduced previously. One showing Mexican federal soldiers offloading trains in Agua Prieta that were coming to defend Agua Prieta against the anticipated invasion of that town by Francisco Pancho Villa in 1915. The lower image is a kind of domestic scene. The Mexican Federals constructed trenches as a defense all around Agua Prieta, and women were hired to come in and to do the daily washing for the soldiers' clothes. They prepared the food, and Cal Osbon captured some of this in one of these interesting photographic postcards at the lower right. Almost all Mexican border towns had a kind of tourist function. After the Mexican Revolution, the curio function of these border towns, tourist locations, really accelerated. And one of the more famous of these in Agua Prieta was that run by Alice Gatliff. Now, Gatliff was a woman of faith of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and her husband ran a series of entrepreneurial efforts in Sonora and in Douglas. And he passed away rather early when they moved to the Sonora-Arizona border. And Alice ended up taking over the businesses. So she was an example of a very early woman that was quite successful as an entrepreneur on the boundary, running her husband's businesses and then creating her own. And she started this Curio Cafe that became an institution for tourists that visited Agua Prieta in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. You see 2 postcards. And in fact, Alice Gatliff is standing with her hand at her side holding a hat in one of the postcards. She was a photographer, and she took many of these postcards and had them then made into took photographs and had them made into postcard images, both real photographs, as the upper card is, and as print photographs, as the lower card shows. She became quite famous because it was in her curio store, as Emery Cobb's map postcard that I showed you earlier illustrated. It was in her curio store that 2 very famous Mexican generals, Alvaro Obregón and Plutarco Elias Calles, actually signed what was called the Plan of Agua Prieta, in which they decided that they were going to fight against their former comrade in arms, Venustiano Carranza, against the Carranza regime, because they felt that he wasn't going to take Mexico where they thought Mexico should be taken. So Gatliff's little cafe became an important landmark in the history of the Mexican Revolution on the Sonora border. The next town to the east of Agua Prieta that I cover in the postcard book is the small town of Naco. Now, some of you might have been to Naco. Many of you probably have never heard of Naco, but Naco was a town that was also founded as a railroad crossing town in the early 1900s. And the image at the lower left on this screen is an International Boundary Commission map that was actually made before the town of Naco was founded. And it was founded across from what is now Naco, Arizona, and just down the road from Bisbee, Arizona. And that map does show Bisbee on it above. The map to the right is the map that I had drafted to use for the book that shows the critical landmarks inside of the border town of Naco, Sonora. And again, there's a church, there's a plaza, there's a bull ring. You can see the railroad that cuts across it as a diagonal. Naco became quite famous because during the time that Bisbee was mining copper and Douglas was smelting some of that copper, there was a town across the border in Sonora called Cananea that was also mining and smelting copper. And some of the reason for Naco to be constructed where it was is to create a rail network that connected Cananea to the international boundary to Bisbee, and then the railroad that also ran all the way across the southern part of Arizona and southern New Mexico to the town of El Paso, where there again was a major smelting operation going on for copper. So Naco became an important place because of this railroad juncture. Naco, like all the Sonora border towns, was a crossing, had crossings, and the border town photographers that came to these places were always intrigued by these crossing points. So in the lower left, you see a print card showing Naco, Arizona on one side, the imaginary line without a fence, I will remind you, in the early 1910s. And then the railroad cars that are shown in that print image are actually in Naco, Sonora. So if you go back to the map I showed you just a minute ago, you'll see that the railroad line cuts at a diagonal across that boundary, and that's in fact what you're seeing in the postcard image in the lower left. The photographic postcard in the lower right is taken from the Naco, Arizona side, looking across to the main street of Naco, Sonora. And then the real photographic postcard image at the upper right is actually the old customs house, a magnificent structure that doesn't exist in the same form as shown in this postcard image today. But it also reminds you of how these customs houses were so important on the Sonora boundary, really on all of the Mexican boundary. And one of the reasons they were so important is that they collected tariffs from the railroad crossings. So they were places that actually had monies that were held until they could be distributed to places that were safer. And it was one of the reasons that during the Mexican Revolution, revolutionary forces wanted to either protect or take over these towns so they could take the money that was held in these customs houses. In fact, Naco is one of the more famous border towns for the Mexican Revolution. It was occupied or attacked 4 different times. And the postcards that are shown in this screen show the federal trenches in the photograph in the middle of the screen that were dug by, again, the forces to try and protect Naco and protect the customs house of Naco from the revolutionary forces that wanted to take over the town. One of the reasons the revolutionary forces wanted to take over the town, besides having the capital that might be in the vaults inside of the customs house, is that if they controlled a border crossing town, they had access to weapons and arms that could be sold by American gun dealers to the revolutionaries. So the Federals wanted to prohibit the revolutionaries from getting those arms, and the revolutionaries wanted the arms themselves. Hence, there were conflicts at these border towns. The map on the left is a very famous map, actually drafted by Plutarco Elias Calles, the general that I mentioned that became famous in Agua Prieta. It was a map he drafted that showed the trenches around the outskirts of Naco, Sonora, as well as different landmarks within the town itself. Then the image at the lower part of the screen shows, this is courtesy of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum, shows tourists that actually came. These trenches that were dug into the ground stayed there for quite some time. And in fact, archaeologists have gone to Naco, Sonora, and actually found where some of these trenches still exist today, even though they've been covered over. They can find them as well archaeologists can do. But anyway, in the 1920s, after the battles, these scars in the landscape became tourist attractions. And you can see in the Bisbee Mining Museum image that these people are coming to look at what happened at Naco during the revolutionary battles. Okay, now we're going to go to the biggest of the Sonora Mexican border towns, Nogales, Sonora. Nogales, Sonora, and Nogales, Arizona today combined are called Ambos Nogales, the 2 Nogaleses. Nogales is a very different border town in the sense that it was laid out in a canyon between 2 high-rise divides of mountains. And so the image at the right of this screen shows, this is another International Boundary Commission map from the 1890s. It shows how the town was laid out on both sides of the boundary through this defile of a canyon with mountains all around it. Anybody that's been to Nogales, and I know that some of you from Arizona have been there, know that it's a flat area, a very narrow flat area surrounded by these hills and mountains on either side of it. The map to the left is a map that was done in the early 20th century after the towns were laid out. It shows just the Nogales, Sonora side, but it illustrates some of the ways in which the town had to be carved literally in this flat piece of terrain between these canyons on either side. One of the most interesting things about Nogales as a border crossing place is that it had multiple crossings. It was a big enough town so that it had a main street crossing between 2 streets. The oldest main street in Nogales, Sonora is called Elias, Calle Elias, and that corresponds to the oldest downtown street of Nogales, Arizona, which is called Morley. Then if you look at the image at the lower left of the screen and you follow up, you'll see a main railroad crossing, which was the crossing shown on the map previously. Then there are 2 other residential crossings that existed that tied in the 2 communities. So people that lived in Nogales, Arizona could cross in these other legal crossings into Nogales, Sonora, and the residential parts of the towns. The 2 images to the right are real photographic postcards, one that looks at the top into Nogales, Arizona from Nogales, Sonora. So you're looking right down Morley Street and a gentleman's sitting on a horse in the middle of the street. And the image at the bottom is a postcard by one of the more famous postcard photographers of Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora. His name was Lohn, L-O-H-N. You can see his name in script in part of the postcard image itself. And he took this postcard view looking into the main street Calle Elias of Nogales, Sonora. Now, if you visited Nogales, Ambos Nogales, you know that the history of this town is fascinating because of the way that a line was created dividing these two towns. The image at the lower left, if you look at it carefully, you'll see that on the Sonora side, which is the left-hand side of the image, there is a setback where the buildings were set back 54 feet when the original boundary survey was created in 1854. The image that you're looking at is actually an image that was taken probably in the early 1910s, but it was taken after 1898 because in 1898, the United States decided that they should have a setback on the US side. So if you look at the buildings at the lower part of that image, it looks like they were shaved in half. And there's actually quite a bit of space that's between the place where the boundary line is and those buildings. And that's because those buildings were literally cut in half when the setback was created by the United States in 1898. So combined, you had a setback now by 1918 of over 100 feet between the two towns. The other images show you the border line and the first fence that was created between two border towns, and that was the fence between Nogales, Sonora, Nogales, Arizona. The upper image shows the fence just going in 1918, and the reason the fence went in, of course, was that the Americans felt that the boundary might be breached by the battles of the Mexican Revolution that was going on at that time. The image at the lower right shows a 1950s view of that boundary with the fence still there. You can still see the setbacks on the Mexican and the American side of the boundary. Nogales, Sonora was a domestic place that was not just a tourist location early in the 20th century, and postcard photographers took pictures of these places. And this is Calle Arispe, the most famous main drag of the early Nogales, Sonora. It shows the various streets with domestic businesses, marketplaces, and vendors that were all places where tourists didn't go, but the postcard photographers were fascinated by these places, so they tended to document them. Some of you know that Arizona border towns were famous for Chinese merchants. The Chinese that were excluded from coming into the United States after the Chinese Exclusion Act, many of them started coming into Mexico and headed to the border and started businesses. The map on the left is Sanborn Fire Insurance map that shows many of the locations of the Chinese merchants that had businesses along Calle Arispe in the early part of the 20th century. And then the postcard view below shows one of those businesses. Nogales became a curio town right after Prohibition. The upper image shows Calle Elias, and it says in the middle, no prohibition here, because during Prohibition, of course, Americans went across the boundary to take advantage of alcohol that was prohibited by the Volstead Act from 1919. But after Prohibition was repealed in 1933, Sonora border towns became places that began to sell tourist activity, and part of that tourist activity were these so-called curio stores, as you see in the lower right image, the Carrasco curio store along Calle Elias that sold all types of curio artifacts and artistry. And so this was the first street, the first curio street of Nogales, Sonora. But as the map shows, the curio establishments began to migrate to the west of Calle Elias. And by the 1950s, Calle Obregon, as it's known today, this was the original Calle Arispe, became the major tourist route, which it remains to this day. So these images show the evolution of these curios, these curio marketplaces, and their various locations along the streets as the tourist district of Nogales, Sonora moved progressively to the west to Avenida Obregon. One of the more famous of the locations in early tourist street along Calle Elias in Nogales, Sonora was the Caverna. Some of you know about this. Sadly, this place burnt down in the 1980s and it was never rebuilt, but from the early 1900s until the 1980s, it was a celebrity institution, a place that many people went to, locals as well as outsiders and people of fame. It was literally carved into the rock by two French residents in late 19th century Nogales, Sonora, to hold liquor and to keep it cool. And eventually it was bought by a Greek family and turned into a nightclub and restaurant called the Caverna. And these images show that through time. The oldest Sonora border town, of course, is Sonoita, as I mentioned earlier, and it's isolated way to the west of Nogales, out in the middle of the Gran Desierto, as it's called in Sonora. You can see where it's located south of Ajo. There really is no formal Arizona border town on the other side today. But Sonoita was a Spanish settlement gained from the 19th century, from the 18th century, as I mentioned earlier, and it was founded as a Jesuit settlement. But it emerged in time by the 1920s and 30s as a Mexican border town. Here are some views of the main street in Sonoita from 1907, 1940s, and 1950s. And again, it shows how border towns or border postcards put together in sequence can actually inform a view of place through time. The same main street is seen in each one of these images, one in the early 1900s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. Sonoita, by the 1930s and 40s, was a gateway to what Arizonans know as Rocky Point, what Sonorans call Puerto Peñasco. And once Sonoita became a border crossing town, one of the places it came in to serve tourists, of course, were bars. So this screen shows a series of border bars in Sonoita in the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s, again showing how the postcards can reveal places through time. Sonoita, because of its far western location and close to the Colorado River and Baja California, actually was a jump-off point for what they were called camioncitos, little buses, but they were essentially cars that would transported people as public transport between Sonoita, San Luis Rio Colorado, and across the Colorado River into the Baja town of Mexicali. So they became known as Mexicali taxis. And here's a photo of one of these from Ronald Ives' collection from the 1930s. But this is one of the things that Sonoita was famous for in the 1930s and 40s. The last border town that I'm going to share is San Luis Rio Colorado, one of the, again, 20th century border towns. The maps on the left of the screen actually show you the international boundary map, a portion of the area before San Luis was founded as a town. On that map, there is a boundary marker 204. That's actually a numbered U.S.-Mexico boundary marker. That's where the present town is today. It's right near that border marker. The map above the Boundary Commission map is a map that shows the old colony of settlers that the Mexican government tried to get established along this part of the Sonora border in the late 19th century. When the colonia collapsed, those people moved to the international boundary and founded the town that became San Luis Rio Colorado in the early 20th century. The map on the right, like the other maps for the Sonora border towns, shows the primary landmark locations and the border crossing of Sonora's San Luis Rio Colorado. Because this was a newer town, there wasn't much in San Luis for a long time. When postcard photographers finally started coming here in the 1940s and 50s, they were taking pictures of a town that basically had just been cast. So these are images from the 1950s of the plaza, the kiosco, and the main church in San Luis Rio Colorado. This particular town, even though there were settlers living here from the early 1900s, was not officially founded as a town and declared a municipio by the Mexican government until 1939. Once it became an official town and tourists started crossing from Arizona into San Luis Rio Colorado, it developed the same types of landscapes that you found in other Sonora border towns. And those became, of course, attractions for tourists. So the postcard photographers took pictures of these crossings in the various curio cafes and bars that were within walking distance of the San Luis Rio Colorado border crossing. So if we look back at these various border towns and we look at the popularity of postcard imagery, we can find that the 1910s was the time in which postcard imagery of the border towns really accelerated. And that, of course, coincided in part with the Mexican revolutionary battles of that era. The 1920s postcards were sustained by the Prohibition era and the popularity of that. So you see how that's continued for Agua Prieta and Nogales, two largest of the border towns that I have postcard images for. And then in the 1940s and 1950s, the golden era of postcard photography, because so many tourists were coming to these Sonora border towns that the number of images really accelerated, especially for Nogales, as it became the premier border crossing town for tourist activity in the years following the Second World War. So if I reflect back in the last few minutes that I have about what can be learned from postcards about the geography of a place. Well, as I said to begin with, postcard utility, meaning its usefulness to a researcher, depends on how many images you have of a place. If you have a lot of imagery, you can actually reconstruct these places and see them through time. My research depends not just on the imagery itself, but also on archival and library sources to corroborate and contextualize my understanding of these border towns. It also depends on going to the places. As a geographer, I firmly believe that you can't really understand a place until you go see it for yourself. So I have to go out into the field and ground truth the images that I'm looking at as postcard photography. I also interview people in places and talk to them about what they can remember about the landmarks like the Caverna in Nogales and other places along the Arizona-Sonora border towns. And one of the things I've realized is that this has a historic preservation application utility, that if you do these reconstructions of these places, when people decide that they're going to restore some of the important landmarks of the Arizona-Sonora border towns, these postcards can be quite useful. So at the end of it, what I'm saying is that you can actually see the past in the present. Postcards are a unique way to visualize that past. Postcards, believe it or not, were kind of the Instagram and the tweet of their era. And they're useful today because they're highly accessible. There were billions of these things made in the golden era of the early 20th century when postcards were essentially the Instagrams and tweets of their generations. They can be acquired online through auction sites. You can buy them. You can go to postcard shows and buy them. And of course, archives and libraries and museums are now collecting them because they realize they have a utility to trying to see the past. So with a sufficient image density and enough postcards, a single place, the past can really come alive, as you see in this mashup produced by one of my former students, where he combined one of my historic postcards of a street in Agua Prieta with a contemporary view of that same street in the 1910s. Okay, that's all I have to say. I think I've said enough, and now I'm ready for your questions and answers, and I thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's so interesting. So we have a few questions already. The first question is, thank you for your fascinating talk. As a librarian, I'm intrigued by your postcard collection and would like to know when and how you started collecting, how many items you own, and how you organize them.
Yes. I started collecting because I have what collectors call the collector's gene. I collected baseball cards, coins, stamps, maps, all kinds of things when I was quite young. And as I became a faculty member and a geography professor, I began to realize that postcards had a view of places that I was fascinated about. So I got together with people. This actually started when I was a faculty member at Arizona State University. And I once responded to something called the Arizona Postcard Club And I went to one of their meetings, and boy, that just all started from there. They told me all about postcards. I learned from them. And over the years, some of these people became my best friends. And I myself became a member of that postcard club. And I began to learn how you can collect them. As I said, you can collect them by going to postcard shows. You can collect them by buying them from online auction sites, which there are multiple of today. So I have, for the Mexican border towns, my archive contains about 10,000 images. It's in the process of being distributed, in fact, because one of my goals after I've written my books using the postcard imagery is that I want to turn them over to an archive that will then digitize them and make them available for future researchers. So my border town postcards are being donated to the Whitliff photographic collection at Texas State University in San Marcos. That's what's happening with me. So how I organize them, that's the third part of the question, if I remember correctly. I organize them, I put them in sleeves. You put them in archival sleeves to try and protect them. And the sleeves then are put into archival boxes organized by each town and then by the topical landmark divisions that I have for each town. And I collect all formats, not just the photographic postcards that I showed you in this presentation. I collect print postcards, I collect chrome postcards. The postcards that you buy today where you can still find postcards, you've looked at them and they look like a photograph, but they're not photographs. They're actually mechanical drawings based on a photograph. But you can tell that if you look at them with a magnifying glass, and you can see the dot matrix pattern in them, because in a real photograph, you will see a continuous surface when you look at it with a magnifying glass. In a print postcard, whether it's a chrome postcard like the ones you see today, or whether it's a print postcard, the pattern of color and arrangement of imagery in the unit itself will actually break up if you begin to look at it with magnification. But photographic postcards don't do this. So I collect all formats. I hope that answers the questions.
That's great. Next question is, do you have any plans of taking this research into the 1960s to the present?
I don't, because one only has one life. And I've decided that I devoted about 12 years of my life to collecting the Mexican border town archive and writing these 4 books. And what you want as an educator is to stimulate people. And I hope these books stimulate people that somebody else might pick up that gauntlet, you see, and might say, oh, this would be fun to do for the Arizona towns. Often people ask me, well, why did you do it for both sides? Well, I started studying the Mexican border towns even before I started writing books about the postcard photography and the postcards of the Sonora and Arizona and other border towns. And people would always ask, but why aren't you collecting and showing the Arizona side? Well, I biased myself initially that I would only do the Mexican side, but that then leaves the gate open, see, for other people to pick up the gauntlet and begin to study the Arizona border towns. And I know there are many collectors of those Arizona border towns. Some might be actually listening to this presentation, so they can write the books themselves. And I've gone on to other kinds of writing, as Jan showed or mentioned in the introduction. I'm now writing a book about Mexican restaurants, but I'm using postcards as part of that, as well as a variety of other ephemera.
That's great. Another question. What was your greatest unexpected discovery or epiphany while conducting this research?
Wow. Well, I can't think, in this short time, I can't think of one that stands out more than another, but I can tell you this. One of the things that I would do when I would go to the towns, as I was doing research for the towns, is that I would reproduce the postcards in digital images and then copy them and put them in little booklets. And I would take those little booklets with me into the field when I would interview people and when I would talk with people. And one of the most amazing things is to show people those photographic postcards or those postcard images of any of the Sonora border towns, and to see how their eyes simply light up when they look at that imagery. Because if they're of an older generation, they recognize a lot of those landmark locations and those street views, and it almost brings tears to their eyes. And that was was so much fun to see that, not to make them cry, but to actually realize that they could recognize some of this past place. And I found that it actually got people talking about their recollection of them. It's like the notion of a photograph is like 1,000 words, well, or 10,000 words, whatever the saying is. And it's true. You'll ask them about a place and they might not say very much, but then you show them the postcard copy of that place, and all of a sudden the floodgates open and they begin to talk about it, and they go, oh yes, I can remember this, and oh yes, then there was this time about that. And pretty soon you've got a narrative from an interview where you hadn't expected anything at all because the image itself prompted somebody to reflect on their own past.
Wow. Another question, do you have any postcards of the old bars in downtown Douglas, such as the Arizona Bar and the Coney Island? I used to sign shoes as a kid in those bars.
I don't. As I said before, I have some postcard views of Arizona border towns themselves. But in the case of, let's say, as an example, Nogales, they're mostly just the street views of Morley, the old downtown of Nogales, Arizona. And I wanted those because as I was writing about the crossing that Arizonans would do going into Mexico, or the Mexicans would cross into the Arizona side, I wanted to see what places they were going to or coming from. But I don't have any, I wasn't a serious collector of those interior views, but I know there are some people that do that. One of the places to go, especially for Nogales, is the Pimeria Alta Historical Society, which has a huge archive and collection of visual materials for both the Arizona side of the border and the Nogales Sonora side of the border. So I would prompt you to go there to find information.
Great. And then we have one more comment. Thank you for your very interesting talk. I was particularly happy to see your information on Naco, Sonora. I'm told my paternal great-grandfather was a customs officer for Mexico working the U.S.-Mexico border.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, the customs officers, in fact, some of these customs officers actually left interview records. In the Bisbee Mining Museum, I should say, there's a whole archive of different customs officers that operated out of Naco, and I think some in Agua Prieta, Douglas, that were interviewed by people. And so their narratives are there. So you might want to go to the Bisbee Mining Museum and see if your relatives actually had something to say to interviewers at points in time, because their interview information is transcribed there, and it would be fascinating for you to discover that. But that's true. The customs officers were remarkable sources of information, as you can imagine, the things that they saw that went on those crossings. And I can tell you that in the early days, from the information that I've learned in talking with people about them, people used to cross those borders almost undeclared. It's nothing like today, where, of course, you have to give, almost blood to cross the border yourself, besides your passport or identification. In those days, the customs officers knew everybody that crossed. There was a regular flow of people coming from the Mexican border town into the Arizona border town, and vice versa. And the American customs officers knew the people that crossed from the Mexican side, and the Mexican customs officers knew the Americans that crossed from the other side. And oftentimes they just let them walk right through. There was no delay of them at all, because they knew who they were. It was that kind of an informal place in an earlier era. Of course, that's disappeared by and large today. Thank you.
I've got another interesting comment. My great-grandfather worked for the railroad as a doctor, was in Minas Prietas for a couple of years until war broke out. So thank you for the information. And I have one more question. Thanks, great presentation. ASU professor with ASU history class attending the presentation. So I have a question from a student in the class. Can you speak to some of the more remarkable changes you witnessed across some of the border towns throughout the 20th century?
Oh, remarkable changes. Well, the towns themselves have changed to a considerable degree. So the thing that's amazing, let me flip the coin around. The thing that's amazing is how much has stayed the same. And this is one of the things that I think you learn as you go to these places more over and over again, is that the buildings, for example, along Calle Elias in Nogales, Sonora, those buildings are still there. The ones that were there from the time that the town was laid out in the late 19th and early 20th century. The same can be said for Agua Prieta. If you walk down the street, the main street, Panamericana in Agua Prieta, Sonora today, the building facades have changed, but the buildings are still there. It's rare that the buildings actually get torn down. Because some of these towns are not the biggest towns, and the parts of the towns that were shown in these historical postcard images are places that are now important to the histories of the town. So I think there are movements in some of these communities to actually preserve the places. And that's one of the things that I hoped my books and my postcards would do, is that it would prompt people to realize that there is a historic past to these places that actually needs to be preserved and set aside for future generations. We've done a lot of this in the United States. I know most people are familiar with this, but in Mexico, the historic preservation movement is just starting. And hopefully it won't all be destroyed before we can actually realize that some of it can be preserved. Thank you.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, thank you so much. I'm just going to switch the screen sharing again one more time. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, Dr. Arreola, and to all of our attendees for joining us today and the really great questions and comments. On the screen, you will see a link to a brief survey, which will also be emailed to you. A colleague also posted it in the chat, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. So please, if you have a few minutes, answer or fill out our survey. We hope to see you at our future events or in our reading room. Have a wonderful day, and thank you again, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.